It's a common image. Abraham Lincoln, the rail splitter, born into abject poverty. But here's a detail that often gets lost. When Lincoln was born, his father, Thomas, actually owned a substantial amount of land, hundreds of acres, in fact, and was, well, relatively established in his Kentucky community.
Yeah, interesting, right?
Because that little-known fact, it kind of hints at a much more complex story than the simple narrative we often hear.
What's fascinating here is how this seemingly small detail challenges our ingrained understanding of Lincoln's origins. It really reminds us that historical narratives are rarely black and white.
Exactly.
And often contain surprising layers that can, significantly reshape our perspective on even the most iconic figures.
Precisely. And on this deep dive, we're not charting battle lines. Instead, we're diving deep into the domestic affairs that consumed Abraham Lincoln's presidency, particularly that incredibly charged period leading up to and during the Civil War.
A huge undertaking.
Yeah. And to guide us, we've got a rich collection of material, ranging from a comprehensive overview on the Vietnamese Wikipedia to the detailed analysis provided by the Miller Center at the University of Virginia.
And that combination of sources is invaluable because it lets us examine Lincoln's domestic challenges through multiple lenses. It gives us a more nuanced and complete picture than if we just relied on a single viewpoint.
Our aim today is to truly grasp the immense pressures Lincoln faced on the home front. We're talking about more than just military campaigns.
Oh, absolutely.
Picture the delicate political maneuvering, the monumental task of mobilizing the nation's economy for a war of unprecedented scale, and, well, the profound wrestling with the fundamental nature of the Union and the deeply entrenched system of slavery.
Yeah.
Think of this as your shortcut to understanding this pivotal era in American history. And to help us navigate this intricate landscape, we have with us our expert, who has a remarkable ability to synthesize complex information and provide crucial context.
Thank you. It's certainly a period marked by deep divisions and, frankly, contradictions. By focusing on these domestic challenges, we can hopefully gain a greater appreciation for the immense responsibility Lincoln shouldered.
So let's go back to the immediate aftermath of Lincoln's election in November 1860. The nation wasn't just tense, it actually began to break apart at the seams.
Indeed. As our sources detail, between his election and his inauguration the following March, 7 states from the Deep South, Alabama, Florida, Georgia, Louisiana, Mississippi, South Carolina, and Texas, they took decisive action.
They seceded.
They seceded from the Union.
And they didn't just leave, they formed their own government, right?
Exactly. Delegates from these states convened in Montgomery, Alabama, and established the Confederate States of America. They even drafted their own constitution.
Yeah.
What's interesting to consider is how similar it was to the U.S. Constitution, yet with some crucial differences that really reveal the core motivations behind secession.
Okay, what were those key distinctions in the Confederate Constitution?
Well, the Confederate Constitution strongly emphasized state sovereignty, explicitly protected the institution of slavery in perpetuity, not just in existing states, but potentially in future territories, too.
Wow, perpetuity.
Yeah. And significantly, it prohibited Congress from enacting protective tariffs or providing federal funding for internal improvements. It also set the presidential term at 6 years.
So those differences weren't just minor tweaks then?
Not at all. They highlight the agrarian South's fear of Northern industrial dominance and their reliance on international trade. I mean, that was a central tension-fueling secession.
And who were the initial leaders steering this new Confederacy?
The convention selected Jefferson Davis, a Mississippi slave owner and former U.S. Senator and Secretary of War, as their president. Alexander Stephens, who was seen as a more moderate voice from Georgia, became the vice president. And Davis's inaugural address is quite revealing. He presented secession as a peaceful act based on the consent of the governed, sort of echoing the principles of the Declaration of Independence about the right to alter or abolish governments that threaten their rights.
That's a very different interpretation of those founding principles than the arguments coming from the North, obviously.
Absolutely. This underscores the fundamental philosophical divide at the heart of the crisis. The South largely viewed the United States as a compact, like an agreement between independent states, where each state kept ultimate authority and could withdraw if it chose.
Like a club they could leave.
Sort of, yeah. Whereas the North, on the other hand, largely saw the Union as permanent, a more perfect union established by the Constitution, where the states had, irrevocably accepted the authority of the national government.
It's a fundamental disagreement on what the United States was.
Precisely. Was it a loose association or a single indivisible nation?
And Lincoln definitely had strong opinions on this, didn't he? He wasn't about to just let them walk away without a word.
Far from it. Lincoln firmly argued that the states had never possessed the kind of independent sovereignty the South claimed. He maintained that by ratifying the Constitution, they had unconditionally accepted the national government's authority.
And the right of revolution argument.
Yeah, regarding the South's appeal to that right, Lincoln offered a sharp, almost legalistic counterargument. He contended that the right to revolution is a moral right that arises when basic liberties are suppressed, not some kind of legal loophole to use whenever a state disagreed with an election outcome.
Right.
He famously questioned what fundamental rights or liberties were being violated simply by his election. Since the South still enjoyed all their constitutional freedoms, Lincoln viewed secession not as a right, but as an unjustified and wicked exercise of physical power.
So while all this political earthquake was happening between his election and inauguration, what was Lincoln actually doing? Was he actively trying to de-escalate things?
Well, our sources indicate he maintained a public silence, probably to avoid further inflaming tensions, but he was actively communicating privately with Congress and key military leaders.
Okay.
He consistently reiterated his campaign promise not to interfere with slavery in the states where it already existed. He even supported the Corwin Amendment, which Congress actually passed, guaranteeing slavery in the existing slave states.
So he was trying to offer some reassurance.
It seems that way, yes. That early move demonstrates his initial commitment to trying to reassure the South, at least on the issue of existing slavery.
But there was a firm boundary for him, wasn't there? The expansion of slavery into new territories, that was the red line.
Precisely. Lincoln firmly rejected the Crittenden Compromise, which was a series of proposed constitutional amendments aimed at resolving the crisis.
What did that involve?
Well, while it included guarantees for existing slavery, it also sought to extend the Missouri Compromise line, effectively allowing the potential expansion of slavery into territories south of 36 degrees 30 array. And Lincoln understood that accepting this would betray a core tenet of the Republican platform preventing the further spread of slavery. He basically instructed Republican leaders to make absolutely no concessions on that issue, effectively ensuring the compromise's failure.
So he drew a line in the sand there.
He did. He also offered no encouragement to the peace convention that was attempting to broker a solution, a firm stance behind the scenes, even if his public pronouncements were carefully measured.
Okay, so what about his inaugural address? That was his first major opportunity to speak directly to the entire nation as president. How did he handle that?
His inaugural address on March 4th, 1861, was a masterfully crafted balancing act. It was resolute in its determination to uphold the Union and to hold, occupy, and possess federal property.
So no backing down on federal authority.
Right. Yet it also adopted a conciliatory tone toward the South. He reiterated his lack of intent to interfere with existing slavery and assured them he would not assail them. He made a powerful appeal for unity, famously stating, "We must not be enemies."
Such a powerful line.
It is. He reminded them that no state could unilaterally leave the Union and clearly placed the responsibility for initiating civil war in the South's hands.
And then, the moment that pushed the nation over the edge, Fort Sumter, Major Anderson needed supplies.
Right.
And Lincoln made the decision to send them, albeit unarmed, with clear notification. It sounds like a very deliberate strategy.
It was a calculated, though incredibly risky move. By dispatching unarmed supply ships with advance notice, Lincoln effectively placed the onus of initiating hostilities on Jefferson Davis.
Put the ball in Davis's court.
Essentially, yes. And Davis did not hesitate. He ordered General Beauregard to demand the fort's surrender before the supplies arrived. The Confederate attack on April 12, 1861, ignited the Civil War.
And with that, the nation was plunged into a conflict far longer and more devastating than almost anyone had imagined at the time.
Indeed. Our sources emphasize that both sides significantly underestimated the war's duration, its immense scale, and frankly, the staggering human cost it would exact.
They thought it would be quick.
Many did. Lincoln initially held onto the hope that cooler heads might prevail in the South, while many Southerners believed the North lacked the resolve for a protracted conflict. Both sides were profoundly mistaken.
So once the war began, Lincoln faced an entirely new set of challenges on the home front. It wasn't just about winning battles on the field anymore.
Absolutely. The Miller Center highlights 7 key interconnected issues that demanded Lincoln's constant attention beyond military campaigns. These ranged from the absolutely critical task of finding effective generals to lead the Union armies.
Ah, yes, the general problem.
which, as we know, was a source of considerable early frustration. Figures like McClellan, famously cautious.
Oh, McClellan and his endless preparations. Lincoln must have been beside himself with impatience sometimes.
He certainly desired more decisive action. Ultimately, the reliance on Grant and Sherman proved to be the turning point in Union military leadership.
Right. What else?
Beyond that, Lincoln had to oversee the raising of a massive volunteer army. Initially, there was a tremendous surge of patriotic fervor, nearly 3 million men eventually serving in the Union forces.
Huge numbers.
But as the war dragged on and casualties mounted, the need for conscription arose in 1863, and that led to significant domestic unrest.
Right. The draft riots. A stark and tragic reminder that the war effort wasn't universally embraced in the North, especially in places like New York City.
Exactly. The New York City draft riots in July 1863 were particularly violent. And then, of course, there was the monumental challenge of financing and supplying the war machine.
How did they even manage that?
Marshaling the American economy for a war of this magnitude was an enormous undertaking. Secretaries of War Cameron and later Stanton, and particularly Treasury Secretary Chase, played crucial roles.
The chase.
Chase spearheaded innovative financial measures like issuing greenbacks paper currency not backed by gold or silver, which was a big deal.
A gamble, really.
It was. And establishing the national banking system in 1863, which provided a more stable and unified financial framework for the Union, the sale of war bonds also became a vital means of financing the war effort.
And while this massive economic mobilization was underway, Lincoln had to carefully navigate a treacherous landscape of political dissent at home. We're talking about the Copperheads, right?
Exactly. These peace Democrats opposed Republican policies, the draft, and particularly the idea of emancipation later on.
So how did Lincoln handle that kind of opposition during wartime?
Well, his response, which included the suspension of habeas corpus, a fundamental legal right protecting against unlawful imprisonment, and the implementation of martial law in some areas, sparked considerable controversy concerning civil liberties. It still does today.
The Vallandigham case comes to mind.
Yes, the case of Clement Vallandigham, a Copperhead congressman who was banished to the Confederacy for his anti-war rhetoric, is a prime example. And that situation, among others, later led to the Supreme Court's ruling in Ex parte Milligan.
What did that ruling say?
It essentially clarified that military trials could not be used to prosecute civilians in areas where civilian courts were still operating. It placed a significant check on executive power during wartime.
Okay. And another challenge was the international front, preventing foreign powers from recognizing the Confederacy.
Yes. While primarily a matter of foreign policy, Lincoln and his administration understood that domestic actions, particularly regarding the issue of slavery, had profound international implications.
How so?
The moral stance against slavery resonated strongly with public opinion in countries like Britain and France, making official recognition of the Confederacy much more difficult for their governments, even if some leaders might have leaned that way for economic reasons.
Interesting connection. Then you have the incredibly complex question of how to conduct the war with an eye towards achieving a lasting peace. What did that look like for Lincoln? Reconstruction, basically.
Exactly. This involved Lincoln's evolving vision for Reconstruction, the process of rebuilding the South after the war. Initially, he favored a more lenient and conciliatory no-revenge approach.
Like the 10% plan.
Right. His proclamation of amnesty and Reconstruction in 1863, offering pardons to most Southerners who pledged allegiance to the Union and accepted emancipation, the so-called 10% plan, reflected this initial inclination.
But not everyone agreed with that approach.
Definitely not. This approach faced strong opposition from radical Republicans in Congress. They advocated for a more stringent approach with greater guarantees for Black equality, as seen in the Wade Davis bill,
Which Lincoln vetoed.
which Lincoln ultimately vetoed using a pocket veto. Early Reconstruction efforts in places like Louisiana highlighted these growing tensions between Lincoln's more forgiving vision and the radicals' desire for a more, transformative Reconstruction.
And of course, underlying everything, woven through all these challenges, was the fundamental problem of slavery itself. Lincoln's personal abhorrence of it versus the complex political realities he had to confront.
Precisely. Lincoln personally detested slavery, famously declaring in an 1864 letter, "If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong." It's a powerful statement.
It is.
However, his initial and primary focus was on preserving the Union. And so he adopted a more pragmatic approach, particularly with the crucial border states in mind, those slaveholding states that remained loyal to the Union. Their loyalty was critical.
So he couldn't just push abolition too hard, too early.
Not without risking losing those states, which could have been disastrous for the Union cause. He initially explored options like compensated emancipation, hoping to incentivize these states to voluntarily abolish slavery while maintaining their loyalty.
Which leads us to the Emancipation Proclamation, a truly watershed moment. But our sources remind us that Lincoln was keenly aware of the constitutional limitations on federal power concerning slavery, right? He couldn't just abolish it everywhere by decree initially.
That's a critical point to understand. Prior to the war, the authority to regulate or abolish slavery largely rested with the individual states. Lincoln initially explored policy options that respected this constitutional framework, like that compensated emancipation idea.
Those efforts didn't really go anywhere.
They met with very limited success, especially in the border states.
So what were the key factors that shifted the political calculus towards the Emancipation Proclamation then? What changed?
Several converging factors played a crucial role. The increasing numbers of enslaved people fleeing to Union lines created a sort of de facto emancipation in those areas. They were voting with their feet.
Right. Contrabands, they were sometimes called.
Exactly. Also, the disruption of Southern plantations and even acts of resistance by enslaved people weakened the Confederacy's ability to wage war. You had abolitionists maintaining constant pressure on Lincoln to take more decisive action.
And the international angle again.
Yes, and from a strategic standpoint, emancipation was seen as a powerful way to hinder foreign recognition of the Confederacy by appealing to that strong anti-slavery sentiment in Europe.
And Lincoln's cabinet meeting in July 1862 was the pivotal moment when he shared his intention to issue the proclamation, even though the official announcement was strategically delayed.
Yes. Lincoln informed his cabinet of his decision to issue an Emancipation Proclamation, grounding it in his war powers as commander-in-chief. It was a military necessity, he argued.
But he waited.
He did. Secretary Seward astutely advised him to wait for a significant Union military victory to avoid the proclamation appearing as an act of desperation, the last measure of an exhausted government, as Seward put it.
And Antietam provided that opportunity.
The Union victory at Antietam in September 1862, bloody as it was, provided that opportunity. It led to the preliminary proclamation soon after, and then the official Emancipation Proclamation taking effect on January 1st, 1863.
Which, as we know, didn't immediately free all enslaved people across the country. What were the specific terms of the proclamation again?
The Emancipation Proclamation declared that all enslaved people in Confederate-held territory were to be considered free. It specifically made exceptions for areas already under Union control and the loyal slave states.
So it applied only where the Union technically didn't have control yet.
Correct, which led some critics then and now to question its immediate impact. But critically, it also opened the door for black men to enlist in the Union Army and Navy.
A truly revolutionary act, as our sources emphasize. And Lincoln himself recognized the profound significance of that decision, didn't he?
He did. He reportedly stated that he had never felt so certain that he was doing the right thing as when he signed the proclamation. Its impact was transformative, even with its limitations.
How so?
Well, over 180,000 black soldiers went on to serve in the Union Army, making a vital contribution to the Union victory. It also significantly exacerbated the refugee crisis, as formerly enslaved people sought refuge behind Union lines, leading to the establishment of a federal system, albeit imperfect, to manage these refugees.
And it set the stage for total abolition.
Absolutely. Lincoln, recognizing the proclamation's limitations as a war measure and potential legal challenges after the war, then became a strong advocate for a constitutional amendment to permanently abolish slavery everywhere in the U.S., which became the 13th Amendment.
Beyond the immense challenges of the war and emancipation, Lincoln's presidency also saw the passage of some truly landmark domestic legislation that shaped the country long after.
Absolutely. Things that sometimes get overlooked because of the war. The Homestead Act of 1862, for instance.
Right, opening up the West.
It was designed to promote westward expansion and, theoretically, democratize land ownership by granting public lands to small farmers for a minimal fee and a commitment to cultivate the land for 5 years.
Did it work as intended?
Well, its benefits weren't always evenly distributed. Land speculators definitely profited too, and it displaced Native Americans. But it fundamentally reshaped the landscape of the American West.
And the Moral Land Grant Act, another piece of incredibly significant legislation from the same year.
Yes, this act transferred vast amounts of federal land to the states with the specific purpose of establishing agricultural and mechanical arts colleges, A&M schools.
The land-grant universities.
Exactly. This was a bold move to democratize access to higher education beyond the traditional elite institutions and demonstrated the federal government's commitment to its growth and development. Interestingly, the act also stipulated that military science be included in the curriculum.
So many of today's big state universities trace their roots back to that.
Many do. And our sources also briefly mention the Pacific Railway Act, funding the Transcontinental Railroad, and the National Banking Act as other key pieces of domestic policy enacted during his presidency. It shows his administration's focus on long-term national development, even amidst the chaos of war.
Now, let's turn to a particularly complex and, frankly, often debated aspect of Lincoln's legacy: his views on race. Our Vietnamese Wikipedia entry, for example, brings up some of his more controversial statements on this topic.
Yes, it's crucial to approach the subject with nuance and within the historical context of the 19th century. It's difficult sometimes. Our sources highlight what appear to be contradictions in some of Lincoln's statements over time.
Like the Charleston debate statement.
For instance, yes, his 1858 remarks during a debate in Charleston, Illinois, where he expressed opposition to social and political equality between white and black people, and even suggested white supremacy. Those are undeniably troubling when viewed through a modern lens. There's no getting around that.
But then, in other instances, he asserted black people's fundamental right to the rights outlined in the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, just as fully as white people. He said that too.
Precisely. And in an 1859 speech in Cincinnati, he clearly stated his belief that slavery was morally and politically wrong and voiced his hope for its eventual eradication across the entire Union.
And the Hodges letter later on.
Then, of course, there's his powerful and unambiguous 1864 letter to Albert Hodges, where he declared, "I am naturally anti-slavery. If slavery is not wrong, nothing is wrong."
So how do we reconcile these?
It paints a complex portrait, doesn't it? It suggests a leader grappling with the deeply ingrained prejudices of his time while simultaneously taking significant, albeit perhaps incremental to our eyes, steps towards recognizing Black humanity and rights. That tension really defines much of his legacy on race.
So it was a really complicated picture, making it difficult to form a simple judgment. Our sources also touch on the ongoing historical reevaluation of Lincoln's racial attitudes.
Yes, historians continue to debate and analyze Lincoln's racial views. Some perspectives, like Lerone Bennett Jr.'s work, highlight the limitations of his thinking by modern standards, arguing his actions were often driven more by political necessity than deep-seated belief in equality.
But others push back on that.
Others emphasize the significant progress he made within the context of his era, arguing his views genuinely evolved. It's important to consider that evolution throughout his presidency, particularly his increasing advocacy for Black men's suffrage, at least for soldiers and the very intelligent, in the later years of the war.
It sounds like a picture of someone whose views were evolving, influenced heavily by the deeply entrenched prejudices of his time, but also by a growing moral conviction against slavery and the realities of the war.
I think that's a fair assessment of what the sources suggest. Our Wikipedia entry also briefly mentions West Virginia and Nevada joining the Union during the war. Just quick notes on those.
Right, wartime statehood.
Yes, these wartime additions are indeed noteworthy. West Virginia officially became a state in June 1863. It was formed from counties in northwestern Virginia that remained loyal to the Union, which really underscores the deep internal divisions within the Confederacy itself.
A state born from the conflict.
Literally.
Yeah.
And Nevada followed in October 1864. Its entry was driven partly by the silver mines, which were strategically important for the Union's finances during the war, and it further expanded the Union's reach in the West.
So as we conclude this deep dive into the domestic affairs of Abraham Lincoln's presidency, what are the most important takeaways that you think our listeners should remember? What's the big picture?
I think the paramount takeaway is the sheer scope and complexity of Lincoln's leadership during the nation's gravest crisis. He was far more than just a military strategist, you know.
Yeah.
He was an exceptionally skilled political leader who had to navigate these deep and bitter divisions, mobilize unprecedented national resources, and fundamentally reshape the country through the Emancipation Proclamation and other crucial domestic policies like the Homestead Act or the banking reforms.
The home front challenges were huge.
Absolutely. The challenges he faced on the home front were every bit as critical and demanding, maybe even more complex sometimes than those on the battlefields.
And hopefully for you listening, this deep dive has shed new light on the intricacies of this pivotal period, providing maybe a richer understanding of the immense pressures Lincoln navigated beyond the battlefield. Recognizing the depth of these domestic struggles really offers a more profound appreciation for his enduring legacy and the multifaceted nature of the Civil War itself.
And perhaps this raises a significant question for you to consider. How do the internal divisions and intense debates that characterized Lincoln's presidency during this time of crisis echo the challenges and debates facing societies around the world today?
Interesting parallel.
Were the fundamental struggles to define a nation's core values, then questions of unity, equality, the role of government fundamentally different from similar struggles we witness now? It invites you to consider the enduring questions of unity, equality, and the proper role of government in times of profound crisis.
Truly compelling food for thought. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.